I know that Paul loved all of his churches, but I think it's safe to say that there was one church that was his favorite. And it was the church that he spoke about more tenderly and more affectionately, and he talked to them in kinder ways than he did any other church. Unlike all of his other letters, he didn't write primarily to correct them or to rebuke them, but instead he wrote to praise them, to love on them, to instruct them. And this is a special thing, but what's special about this church? Why this church was his favorite? I don't know that I can answer that, but I think a quick review of this church can shed some light on possibly why some reasons might be that Paul loved them so much. This church is established in Acts chapter 16 on Paul's missionary journey, and it is a church with a most unusual beginning. There are three stories and three interesting characters that come together to sort of explain the basis, the jumping off point for this particular church. The first goes like this. When Paul and his boys arrived in Philippi, they first went out on the Sabbath, to a river. And they heard that there was a group of God-fearing people there who would gather together, and they would have prayer and, kind of a little Bible study. Certainly sounds like Paul's crowd, so off they go. And there, the first person they meet is Lydia. Lydia is a woman from Asian ethnicity. She was a successful business owner. She had homes in the two major cities for fashion in the ancient world. Today, it would be kind of like a fashion designer, clothing mogul, entrepreneur, millionaire who had homes in Paris and New York. This became the first convert on the continent, and it was a big surprise, not who you'd expect. Story 2. While walking around and teaching, Paul is constantly being harassed and beset by this deranged young slave girl. She has a spirit of divination. She's manic. We might say she's crazy. She's out of her mind. These spirits that tell the future within her force her to continue to shout that Paul is the servant of the Most High God. And while it's true, Paul was, it was, to use Paul's word, annoying. And he couldn't preach or teach with her clamoring on all the time. So finally, an exasperated Paul tossed the spirit out of her and forever closed the doors on what was a lucrative fortune-telling business ran by her owner. You can imagine they weren't happy. So in the resulting tumult, Paul and Silas are arrested. And here we are, story 3. They're handed over to a jailer. And unfortunately, by this time, it had become pretty run-of-the-mill for these two. They'd been jailed a lot. The jailer, he was a battle-hardened former frontline Roman soldier, and he was told to keep them safe, but he was a really brutal man. Instead of just keeping them safe, he put them in stocks, terrible things that contorted the body into all these painful positions that induced spasms and muscle cramps. And seemingly he did this for no other reason than his own personal sadistic enjoyment. But at midnight, with Paul and Silas worshiping, the jail was rocked with an earthquake. It tore it open, and everybody, their chains fell off and they were freed. And the jailer assumed that everybody would escape, so he drew his sword to kill himself. And Paul called out for him and said, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." And he proceeded to teach this guard and his family about Jesus. And he baptized him. That's quite a start, isn't it? Really, think about it. You got an Asian female clothing designer, an abused and exploited little girl. You've got a heartless Roman soldier. Not exactly the trio that you'd expect to plant a church with, is it? And yet, it was. But it's certainly not the church that you would expect to be Paul's favorite. And yet, it seems it was. Why might this have been his favorite? Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think Paul had a thing for authentic transformation. You see, Paul was a real guy. At every stage of his life, he was always true to himself, whether good or bad. But when Jesus broke in and changed him, it was real. It was powerful. It was obvious. It was drastic. And maybe that was the appeal of this church. Maybe this was a church that Paul saw. This is a group of train wrecks. But he was watching God radically change them and transform them. So with that in mind, let's jump into lesson 1. And this is a lesson on being unified and purpose-driven as a church. It comes to us from chapter 1, and we're going to be looking at verses 3 through 11. Now, this section shows us this theme of transformation, and it's something that Paul was so proud of in these Christians. He was pointing out to all the time that these were transformed, and they were doing it in 3 ways. He used 3 ways. He kept saying what we are, what we are becoming, and what we will be. What we are becoming, and what we will be. The first is what we are. The members of the church at Philippi were really a pretty amazing group. They were truly and deeply loved by Paul. What made them so special? I think that verses 3 and 4 and 5 and 7 point out some things that made him special. Let's listen to them. I give thanks to my God for every remembrance of you, always praying with joy for all of you in every prayer, because of your partnership in the gospel from the very first day until now. And indeed, it is right for me to think this way about all of you, because I have you locked in my heart, and you all are partners with me in grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and the confirmation of the gospel. You see, these are really powerful words. And the first thing that Paul points out to them is that they are a joy to their leaders. A joy to their leaders. In fact, this word joy is not just the word joy. It means a source or fountain of one's gladness. Paul says, in essence, y'all are the reason for my happiness. You bring me joy. What a blessing it is to lead a church of people who are the source of joy to their leaders. That's who they were, and that's why it was special to Paul. Second, Paul explains that this church is made up of partners in the gospel. Now, this is a church full of workers. This is a church full of dedicated members. This is a church full of people who are using their skills and talents and resources to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. They're partners. They're committed. And again, we can see why a group of people like this, devoted to serving kingdom purpose, would be a people who are very special to Paul. That's what they are. They're a joy to their leaders, and they are full partners in the gospel. What a special place. But moving on from there to the next category, not only what they are, but what they are becoming. And for this we look at verses 6 and 9. Paul says, I am sure of this, that he who started a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And I pray this, that your love will keep on growing in knowledge and growing in every kind of discernment. You see, these were the words that he talked about. Transformative process is happening. These were people that Paul could say about them in a few chapters, just like he said about himself. We've not yet arrived. We're not yet perfect. We're not who we will be, but we're in the process of being remade by God's loving hand. And Paul had a clear picture of how they were being transformed and what God was doing. And look specifically with me at this process of refinement that Paul's pointing out. First of all, it's God who's doing the work. This is not them fixing themselves or transforming themselves. This is not a self-help treatise or process. It's a God-help process. And he's the one behind it. He's the force. Second, it's a lifelong process. Their transformation will not be complete until Jesus returns. But in the meantime, their love for God, their love for each other, their love for mankind is growing day by day in knowledge and wisdom. You see, this is who they are actively in the process of becoming. And it's beautiful. Finally, we catch a glimpse, third, of who they will be someday. Again, we look at verse 6, and this time we cap it with 10 and 11. I am sure of this, that he who started a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ, so that you may approve the things that are superior, and you may be made pure and be blameless in the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. You see, day by day, little by little, God is making them into what they will ultimately become. Pure, blameless, fruitful for God, those who bring him glory and those who bring him praise. You see, that's a beautiful picture. A beautiful picture of a wonderful church, and it's no wonder that this was Paul's favorite. But it also gives us some clear opportunities to examine ourselves. What about us? Would we be a church that's a favorite of Paul? What about us? What about us? Are we truly who we are? Are we a pleasure of source, a deep joy for our leaders? Are we deeply committed with our talents and resources moving forward the kingdom message? Is that who we are? What about who we're becoming? Are we growing day by day into completion? Are we finding our love daily deepening, our knowledge widening, our wisdom increasing? What about who we will someday become? Are we allowing God to do the work in us, to bring us to purity, to blamelessness, to fruitfulness, and to be a cause of glory and praise to the Father? You see, I think these are very good considerations for us this week. And I hope you will be well. And I hope you will be blessed. And I hope that you will be who God is working within you to help you become. And I hope that in every possible way, these words today will be words that will stick in our week and help us to recognize and understand that God is making us over to be something greater than we presently are. Who are we? Who are we becoming? And what will we ultimately be? Let's ask God to open our hearts to these questions this week.